Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into the second half of Rageaholics, Abraham Lincoln, American Dictator. If you did not see part one, you definitely want to check that out. Before you continue on with this episode, I'll put a link in the description that'll take you not only to his original content, but also to part one of my response, where we look at the first 29 and a half minutes of this rant, I guess is what you would say. We'll see if chapters 3 and 4 of his argument get any better than chapters 1 and 2 were, which I thought were pretty poor. But let's go ahead and dive in and see what happens. You mean George Washington, the Federalist? Since you went on a long rant yesterday about Federalists. Now, I will say this before he dives into this part. I would say that if one is going to make any arguments against Abraham Lincoln as a great president, this is where you hit him, is with some of the stuff that he did during the Civil War, believing he was doing what was in the best interest of preserving the country, but that many people would argue, and many people argued at the time, especially the Democrats, were the acts of a tyrant, the acts of a dictator. And I will not take a strong opinion in defending Lincoln for some of this stuff, because I do agree that he overstepped his power in some ways.
Not cutting. Truth of the matter is, Abraham Lincoln was America's very first dictator. Many such mongoloids in academia make the more elevated argument that he was like a benevolent king.
One of the things I don't like about this guy, and he just gave a perfect example of it there, probably some of the same reasons that I don't like Atten Shea, is that I feel like if you're going to make... I get it. It's sensationalism. It gets clicks. It gets people to like your videos. Maybe it's just a matter of a differing approach to these things. But when you start insulting people who take a differing opinion, or when you start the entire video by basically saying my opinion is the only correct one in this situation, you kind of lose me a little bit. And when you start with like stuff like calling people mongoloids, it's not just inappropriate, it's downright wrong. But
which frankly is a spin so charitable it ought to be fucking tax exempt. Under the Magna Carta, the King or Queen of England could suspend habeas corpus, meaning the requirement to be told what you're being charged with and provided with legal counsel only through an act of Parliament. The many mean monkeys who giddily tongue Abe's top hat bedecked balls will often enjoin that James Madison himself suspended habeas corpus, to which I respond with a full-throated bull fucking shit he did. During the War of 1812, habeas corpus was indeed suspended for a specified duration when and only when Congress voted for it. The only thing James Madison did was not fucking veto it, even upon the urging of the more statist inclined that he do so unilaterally and immediately. He went out of his way to specifically declaim the authority to do so. Lincoln, meanwhile, knew better than the father of the Constitution. He circumvented Congress entirely and suspended habeas corpus his own damn self, then set upon the enterprise of deporting his political enemies in the North or jailing them for infractions as minor as neglecting to include a prayer for Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of a public church service, as no shit the Lincoln administration required by what they construed as law for the duration of his despotic administration.
I thought he argued a little while ago in the first part of my reaction that Lincoln was an atheist. Why would he require prayer? All right, so I want to dive into this one a little bit because I feel like there's something missing in what he's telling us here. Okay, so I just spent the last 20 minutes trying to find some record somewhere of someone being arrested for not including a public prayer of Lincoln. I'm not arguing it didn't happen, because I can't, you can't necessarily disprove something just because you can't find it. I just couldn't find any record of it. I wish he would have included some kind of source where that was specifically stated. You guys help me out. If you know of this issue, please help me out and use the comment section below and let me know who the person was and what the circumstances were, because I feel like there was probably more to the story than that. Estimates are that somewhere around 15,000 Americans were arrested at one time or another by the Lincoln administration in some form, but we don't know the circumstances of every one of those and what they were, but that definitely happened.
Folks, Lincoln wasn't a king, whatever the literally sitting on a fucking throne Lincoln monument might suggest, let alone the post-death portrait commissioned by Congress portraying an angelic Abraham Lincoln ascending to heaven, flanked by fucking cherubs on the taxpayer's dime.
Okay, but I could pull up the same kind of stuff for George Washington and a whole bunch of other people, you know, and arguing that he's a tyrant because the people who made the Washington Monument 60 years after Lincoln died put him on something that looks like a throne. These are not arguments in favor. You know, stick to the facts, right? Don't stick to stuff like this to try and make your case.
Folks, at the time, understand this. Lincoln had more power than any king, and a greater tendency by far for authoritarianism. Secretary of State William Seward would later be heard bragging to British diplomats that he had more authority to jail his enemies than the Queen herself.
Well, the Queen didn't have any power by this point. She was a constitutional monarch who had very little real power. That is not an argument. The president today has more power to jail people than the King of England does.
Sadly, only European papers had the pendulous balls to publish that quote. No one put it more plainly than Ohio Congressman Clement L. Vallandigham, who in famous reply to Abraham Lincoln's State of the Union address enjoined that Abraham Lincoln's assumption of illusory war powers was, quote, a dangerous violation of the Constitution, which this civil war is professedly waged to support.
Clement Vallandigham was the head of the Copperheads. He was literally deported out of the country because he was leading rebellion against the United States from within the government. That's not a guy I'd be quoting to make my case.
And the declaring war without a congressional vote was, quote, the kind of dictatorial act which would have cost any English sovereign his head at any time.
He couldn't declare war because it wasn't a foreign country. You couldn't get a declaration of war against your own people. He was putting down a rebellion, an armed rebellion. They had fired on a fort, okay? They had fired the first shots of this war. For months leading up to the war, the Secretary of War, John Floyd, was diverting federal military resources into southern forts and southern warehouses and storehouses, knowing that they were building up to a rebellion.
Time within the last 200 years, unquote. Abraham Lincoln disproved both these assertions by having General Burnside march troops to his front doorstep and deport him to Canada for the crime of criticism. I should add that most of his speech was devoted to criticizing Lincoln's tax policy.
So here's what I find interesting about this. He's quoting Clement Vallandigham in a video in which he's arguing that the Civil War was not about slavery. But let's listen to Clement Vallandigham's own words on the topic. He described the present war as a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war, a war not being waged for the preservation of the Union, a war for the purpose of crushing out liberty and erecting a despotism, a war for the freedom of the blacks and the enslavement of the whites. And that if the administration had so wished, the war could have been honorably terminated months ago. So what he's talking about here when he said Burnside went to his front door, Ambrose Burnside was in charge of the Department of the Ohio. And he had issued General Order number 38, which made it illegal in his department to criticize the war. Which obviously we all, I think, would agree is overstepping your bounds, you know, to ban free speech. But let's point out here that free speech is not legal in places like England, right? So if I put something racist on a social media account in England, I could be arrested for that. Here, that would make me an idiot and a horrible human being, but it would not be a crime. So that's kind of what leads to all this. And so Vallandigham, by this point, has been voted out of Congress. and he's speaking out strongly against the government. And that's when Burnside goes and has him arrested. It says Lincoln, who considered Vallandigham a wily agitator, was wary of making him a martyr to the Copperhead cause, and on May 19th, 1863, ordered him sent through the enemy lines to the Confederacy. While he was within Confederate lines, Vallandigham said, "I am a citizen of Ohio and of the United States. I am here within your lines by force and against my will. I therefore surrender myself to you as a prisoner of war." So he was sent to Wilmington, North Carolina by President Davis and was briefly put under guard as an alien enemy. So Lincoln writes to several congressmen offering to revoke Vallandigham's deportation order if they would agree to support certain policies of the administration. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated than he's making it, and it certainly was not a situation where Lincoln sent Burnside to Vallandigham's front door and had him deported to Canada. There's a lot more to it than that.
He wasn't deporting traitors. He was deporting and arresting political opponents.
True.
But assuming acolytes of the Lincoln cult even acknowledged Lincoln was a dictator at all, they inevitably argue the top-hatted titwank had ample logical justification to assume dictator powers. In short, it were war and he inherited it. Two problems with that. One, Lincoln inherited a secession crisis. He created a fucking war. And two...
Oh, did he fire the first shot? Did his military fire the first shots?
To the provision in the Constitution that allows for fucking wartime presidential powers at all. I'll wait. The problem with exculpating Abe's autocracy on the basis that he had wartime presidential powers is that wartime presidential powers were a fiction fucking invented by Abraham Lincoln.
So much of the executive today is invented by a president, right? You know, a lot of things, presidents just looked at the Constitution and interpreted what they believed they could do. And Congress has done the same thing, and so has the Supreme Court. All three branches of government have taken on powers and authority and abilities that were not explicitly granted to them in the Constitution. And then they basically challenged the other two branches to check their powers, to use their checks and balance. And a lot of that did happen during the American Civil War. The courts did try to check Lincoln. They had done the same thing to people like Andrew Jackson, who he keeps quoting in here. Andrew Jackson, who famously was ordered by the Supreme Court to do something and then said, well, they made their ruling, now let's see them enforce it. So if anything, you want to argue first dictator, I'd say Andrew Jackson was.
Congress, not the commander-in-chief, may assume or confer wartime powers in the event of emergency. James Madison never invoked war powers when New England refused to participate in the War of 1812, effectively seceding from their official obligations in that conflict. Yet, wonder of wonders, Honest Abe found him just lying around through all...
Oh, did some state in New England fire on a federal fort? Don't remember that.
A barkingly batshit interpretation of the Constitution that construes the president's duty to, quote, take care that laws be faithfully executed, with the president becoming the law lest his subjects be faithfully executed.
So, one other thing I want to point out, let's go back to, if you're arguing that using troops to go after rebellious citizens is a dictatorial thing to do, George Washington, as president of the United States, led an army in the field and marched on southwestern Pennsylvania to put down a whiskey rebellion. Thankfully, it never came to a lot of people being killed in that situation.
Lincoln doesn't have the "it was war" defense because it wasn't one until his actions upon assuming the office, and he doesn't have a wartime powers defense on account of he fucking invented them. Lincoln felt he knew better what the founders meant than even the fucking founders did.
Every president, well, not every, many presidents have had that attitude. I'm not defending Lincoln arresting a bunch of people and then holding them without trial and without charge. That was wrong. And it should be stated that it was. But these are not the arguments to make beyond that.
assuming his non-existent emergency powers unilaterally and without consent of Congress, secure in the knowledge that the radical Republicans, under perhaps the only man more authoritarian than himself, Thaddeus Stevens, would cover his bony ass. And oh, did they ever. Months after the fact, Abraham Lincoln already having ascended to downright dictatorship, Stevens convened a session of the Senate to finally vote whether to grant him the emergency powers he was...
Thaddeus Stevens was in the House, not the Senate. And he didn't have the power to convene anything because he wasn't the Speaker of the House. So none of that is true. But what I think he's about to argue here is that the House, that Congress granted Lincoln those powers. Okay, then. So, yeah, Lincoln got a little ahead of himself, but then the House backed him up. So if your argument is that Congress has that authority, not the president, well, Congress used that authority.
Already abusing. Opening by stating that as Abraham Lincoln had already invoked those powers without their permission, the motion to grant them would therefore be assumed to have passed, then immediately adjourned the session and sneered as political opponents of the act, who may well have outnumbered the yea votes, might I add, made passionate but impotent pleas excoriating Abraham Lincoln and his political pawns for violating the Constitution. And I doubt very much if Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans feared for their safety, as he was no doubt aware of the Secretary of State's new secret police, you heard that correctly, who were well armed and within earshot should the protests turn violent. And speaking of which, anyone who knows anything about Alaska will doubtless have a more than passing familiarity with William Seward. But long before he was spending way too much of our money acquiring Canada's mini fridge in Alaska, Seward launched a faltering...
Canada's mini fridge. Okay.
Bid to secure the Republican nomination, which Lincoln would later inhabit, spawning the conciliatory gesture of making Seward his Secretary of State. Even a middling student of history likely knows all that. What most do not is that Seward was also the fucking Himmler of the Lincoln cabinet.
Seward was also one of the strongest abolitionists in Lincoln's cabinet.
After Lincoln's unilateral assertion that he possessed emergency powers enumerated precisely fucking nowhere in the Constitution, and with pro-secession sentiment reaching a fever pitch in the North, given the tight business ties between New York entrepreneurs and their trading partners in the South, Seward set out forming a secret police whose stated goal was to suss out, and I quote, disloyalty. But functionally speaking, they were professional quashers of dissent. Period. Praise Jefferson Davis. Better hope your Republican neighbor didn't overhear. With habeas corpus suspended, you can and will be arrested without trial. And many, many were. We all know about the Southern secession, but there was very nearly a central confederacy to go along with it, largely comprised of non-slaveholding border states such as Maryland, who sympathized with Southern grievances like the abrogation of the right of secession and excessive tariffs and taxation. So aggrieved were the residents of Maryland that the state legislature began holding debates on the merits of seceding themselves. Lincoln flipped his fucking shit. The legislature acceded to his wishes and publicly declared they would not be voting on secession. Only for totally not a dictator Abraham Lincoln to arrest the entire state legislature of the state of Maryland all the same, those who didn't fucking flee anyway. A Maryland judge determined the president was not within his constitutional authority to do any of the above, a judgment which Lincoln elected to leave on red, and did it anyway. The local press pitched a fucking fit, with one editorial.
Let's remember, too, that a mob of citizens fired on federal troops marching through Baltimore on their way to Washington. Here's the thing, and this is why it's so complicated. Yes, did Lincoln overstep his authority? Absolutely. But there's no other presidency you can compare to Lincoln, to where you can say, well, look how Lincoln handled a armed rebellion by a third of the nation, compared to how other people dealt with it. Lincoln was in Washington, D.C. Right across the river was Confederate Virginia. Right on the opposite side is Maryland. A Maryland that is pro-slavery, that has a mob of citizens that have fired on federal troops already. It was a desperate situation, and there's a reason why the Constitution allows for the the suspension of habeas corpus during times of rebellion, because the Constitution, the framers, recognized that a time of rebellion is a very unique situation in which certain freedoms that are otherwise granted to citizens have to be taken away in order to be to deal with that situation. So they recognized that. And Lincoln just took that and kind of pushed the boundaries of it.
Penning a scathing indictment in the pages of the Baltimore Exchange, deploring the president for his autocratic proclivities. He was immediately imprisoned, and he was in good company. Over the coming year, an estimated 13,000 political opponents and journalist critics in the North would be arrested without charge or affordance of trial. That editorialist's name? Francis Key Howard, grandson of American icon Francis Scott Key, the lawyer and poet who famously authored The Star-Spangled Banner while witnessing the English assault on none other than Fort McHenry, the very same fort that his grandson and thousands of others were now held in without charge or legal counsel for months on end, all for the crime of criticizing the president in print. Honest Abe, ladies and gentlemen. Incidentally, Howard's incarceration would provide the subject for the book 14 Months in American Bastilles, which, despite the unceasing suckfest for Abraham Lincoln in years since, somehow managed to be housed in the Library of Congress, presumably when less totalitarian heads later prevailed. But for the time being, the crackdown had begun. The anti-Führer furor reached such white-hot pitch in the state of Maryland that an anti-Lincoln third party hit the ballots hard. And in the event you're still reeling from our more recent forays into electoral fortification, you may be interested to note that Seward, under direct orders from Abraham Lincoln, had all opposition party ballots color-coded so that they could be taken to a neutral location and presumably fucking burned. And that's if they even got a goddamn vote, as Honest Abe ordered the government to print posters urging all citizens to point out Peace Party activists to Seward's secret police.
So like I said, I don't disagree with his views on Lincoln on this particular topic, so I'm not going to really interrupt him too much unless I hear him say something I know is categorically wrong. And some of this stuff, like the color-coded ballot thing he's talking about, I don't know one way or the other, because honestly, that's the first time I've ever heard that. I'm not saying it didn't happen.
And thus an appalling number of Baltimore citizens were arrested while carrying the wrong color ballot. The official charge, you inquire? And I quote, polluting the ballot box. And you thought Baltimore was corrupt on the fucking wire. In the time of Lincoln, long before the internet or fucking phones, there were two primary methods of communicating information: newspapers and the telegraph. Abraham Lincoln censored them both. And we're not talking, an intercept here, a false message there. I'm talking full bore. Lincoln made a list of over 100 newspapers in the North that had been critical of himself, and then ordered the Postmaster General to refuse them fucking mail service. New York papers in particular were singled out in censorious fashion. The New York Daily News, owned by Ben Wood, brother of Fernando Wood, then mayor of New York City, himself an incisive critic of old Abe, elected to apply some aikido to the problem. He paid for private couriers and delivery services to dispense his paper to each and every customer on the route. Lincoln ordered federal marshals to arrest them. The paper went out of business within 6 fucking months. By late 1861, virtually every one of the hundreds of newspapers all across the country critical of Lincoln had been shuttered or silenced, even at the times with the aid of military force. And whatever newspapers could not be cowed with threats or outright imprisoned due to personal or political connections, unknown mobs of ransackers who looked an awful lot like William Seward's secret police with potato sacks on their skulls simply broke the fuck in and pulverized their printing press with sledgehammers and pickaxes. Hell, sometimes they didn't even trouble it.
All right, so unless you've got proof that these were paid government agents doing this, you could just as easily argue that these were just people who the same kind of stuff happened during the American Revolution. People did similar things to pro and anti-crown publications. This kind of stuff happens in civil war, which is what the revolution was in many ways. So it sounds to me like he's pinning this on them without any real evidence of that. Stick to the facts. There's plenty to hit Lincoln and his administration with real facts without speculation.
to disguise themselves. When the Democratic Standard in Washington, D.C. dared discuss Abraham Lincoln's micromanagement and military blunders during the First Battle of Manassas, uniformed military barged the fuck in the front door and set fire to the building during working hours. Something you have to understand about the Civil War is that it did not go well for the Union initially, and as fatality figures went from rough to awful to biblically butt-fucking bad, the so-called Peace Party became ever more vocal in the North. Crucially, most of the censorship described in this video occurred long the fuck before that. Contrary to the cunts who allege Abraham was a man made for his time, a humble individual turned tyrant in response to events beyond his ken, the historical record is transparently clear. This was an authoritarian in waiting, ever vigilant for a sufficient excuse to honor the rigors of his repugnant programming. His earliest political statements, stretching back to the 1840s, assert the need for central planning and the strong arm of authoritarian government. Hell, in his introductory speech upon achieving his first ever political office, Lincoln said, quote, "I am humble Abraham Lincoln. My politics are short and sweet like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank, in favor of the internal improvement system, see business bailouts and mercantilism, and a high protective tariff."
None of that is evidence of a authoritarian tyrant. Those are the politics of the day. That is a strong central government. Something that quite a few other presidents were in favor of. Something that Abraham Lincoln was in favor of. I mean, not Abraham Lincoln. George Washington was in favor of. Was he a tyrant?
Unquote. The Civil War did not make him that way. Abraham Lincoln helped make the Civil War. Stop fucking praising him for it, or you'll keep getting more of the same. Under circumstances such as these, it's remarkable there were any more northern newspapers willing to criticize the president at all. The fact that there were hundreds speaks to the deep and abiding resentment of Lincoln's dictatorial behavior, even under threat of destitution, execution, or imprisonment.
No, that's... The fact that there were hundreds isn't evidence of that. You got to remember, at this time in history, newspapers had a very strong partisan slant to them. The idea of news as this like impartial communicator of the facts that we have today, or at least that they claim to be today, did not exist at this time. Many of these newspapers were called like the Democrat or the Republican or the Whig. Like they were intentionally, specifically in favor of one party or one ideology. And so, yeah, newspapers that were Democratic newspapers were going to criticize him no matter what. Even if he hadn't done any of this stuff, they would have been critical of him. So saying that there were hundreds of newspapers speaking out against him, yeah. And there were hundreds more that were speaking out for him.
If you are a defender of Abraham Lincoln's assumption of dictatorial powers to preserve the Union, there is one inexplicable and indefensible fact that simply will not die. If Abraham Lincoln's cause was ending slavery rather than preserving a territorial and taxation monopoly, then why, with all the powers at his disposal, did he never use one of them to force manumission or compensated emancipation of slaves?
Because he didn't have the power to do that. He didn't have the authority to do that. So I would throw the question back at him. If he was the dictator you say he is, if he was the one who ignored the Constitution anytime he wanted to, why didn't he use it to do that when he was pushing through the 13th Amendment, when he was very obviously speaking strongly at the end of his life in favor of things like black people having the right to vote and having full freedom and citizenship?
Policies that worked in Europe 2 decades before the American Civil War was even a distant danger. If he had the dictatorial power to raise an army with a draft, jail journalists, shutter newspapers, arrest judges, and deport his political adversaries, he had the power to force through the same policy that freed slaves in under 6 years in England, and did so without firing a fucking shot.
The policy that freed the slaves in England in the 1830s was passed by Parliament. It wasn't instituted by, would have been King William IV at the time. It wasn't instituted by some dictator saying, this is the way it's going to be. Their legislature passed it. When Congress passed it, they did it in the United States with the 13th Amendment.
And there's only one answer. He didn't want to free slaves.
He couldn't.
And saving the Union was the code word he used interchangeably to obfuscate his true agenda, the accretion of centralized government power. And only a war against him.
You can criticize the acts, the arrests, things like that. Now you're into speculation. Now you're into projection. Now you're saying, well, I know that's what he said, but here's what he really wanted.
His own citizens could perform that feat. What occurred in America is not at all unique. While Europe ended slavery peacefully by buying out slave owners, some countries instead used abolition, even after opposing it, just as Lincoln did, as a convenient method of organizing resistance to seize the levers of power. Nations like Colombia, Venezuela, not the coziest of company, I'd add, but it's a greater insult to the countries in question, frankly. The bloodshed in Venezuela and Colombia's anti-slavery uprisings, which likewise expanded state power inexorably thereafter, never for a moment rose to the level Lincoln prescribed. He alone was willing to war with half his country, and yet that...
First of all, it wasn't half the country. It was a third of the country. And it was actually, when you talk about the white population who weren't owning other people, or who owned other people, you're about a fourth of the country's population.
It's Lincoln's only company. Aspiring tin pot authoritarians from Central and South America who use slavery as a cudgel to crumple their constitution and enact their own statist vision. Welcome home, Honest Abe. To even begin to entertain the fiction that Lincoln was a liberator in private and a despot in public only for the benefit of exigency or public sentiment, you not only have to dismiss decades of public and private statements, not to mention presidential actions which repeated...
None of the statements that you have showed me in this 46 minutes of this video have proven the things you're arguing. The statements you're pulling out just demonstrate a pretty rank and file Whig, not a authoritarian despot.
Contradict that imaginary aim, but much more tellingly, you have to willfully ignore the only consistent position of Abraham Lincoln's life: his complete, undeviating dedication to subjugating the American people to the centralizing hand of the federal government. It's the only thing in his entire career he's consistent about, and it's the one thing Lincoln's army of apologists refused to even momentarily consider. Maybe Lincoln didn't wage war with half the country so he could free slaves he expressed public contempt for, while European powers did so peacefully. Maybe he didn't lock up opposition journalists because it was wartime and he had a union to save. Maybe, just maybe, he did it to employ the same remedy he prescribed for every other ill afflicting America: unbridled, abject authoritarianism.
He didn't prescribe that for any of those things. You're making that up and you're cherry picking quotes, and even the quotes that you're using don't say that.
Was Abraham Lincoln a dictator? Put it this way. Benito Mussolini's black shirts would pluck a page from Honest Abe and do the exact same thing to their most visible journalist critics in their ascent to power, and I don't know many who contend old Benny Spaghetti weren't a fucking dictator. Now, there'll doubtless be sneering and mid-wit mockery about how I wish Trump had done that, but this wasn't the modern corporate press, you half-smart simps. These were homegrown local papers. This was less like Trump calling the New York Times his bluff, and much more like Biden strong-arming social media to silence his critics using the FBI as a bludgeon. Newspapers being, after all, the social media of their era. Careful what you wish the fuck for. You might already have it.
Okay, I got no problem with that quote.
The black heart of the Civil War holds an even more darksome truth by far. As I've previously intimated, not only was it not waged to end the enterprise of slavery, it was arguably only peripherally waged even to preserve the territorial and tax monopoly they held during a time of financial crisis in the North. Look, in a central philosophical context, the real reason the Civil War was waged was to end the heretofore universally acknowledged right of secession, something Lincoln...
Universally acknowledged right of secession. Show me evidence it was universally acknowledged as a right. Show it to me. Where is it?
Most ardent defenders are inevitably forced to argue does not exist in order to absolve their neck-bearded Buddha of culpability. The Union, they argue, was voluntary to join, sure, but inviolable once entered into, and thus all the tyranny, all the unjustified jailings, the establishment of a secret police, indeed the Civil War itself, is all permissible under the proviso that he did it all to save the Union. This despite 3 separate states reserving the right to secede when they joined, including at least one, Virginia, who had that written into their state's declarative document. The Union of the Founding Fathers was voluntary. Lincoln didn't save that Union.
All right, I got to call out that one because of his claim about states reserving the right to secede in their founding documents. So here you go. The claim that Virginia, Maryland, or Rhode Island reserved in their ratification instruments a right of secession is false. Maryland said nothing on the subject, and although states' rights feeling was particularly strong in Virginia and Rhode Island, neither of those states asserted a right of secession either. On the contrary, the Virginia ratification instrument acknowledged expressly that, quote, the powers granted under the Constitution were, quote, derived from the people of the United States. And Rhode Island instrument stated that, quote, that all power is naturally vested in and consequently derived from the people. Both Virginia and Rhode Island acknowledged the general right of revolution against an oppressive government, but both asserted that right for the people, not for the states. A proposed statement on the general right of revolution was rejected by the Maryland Convention. You can read the ratification acts, so on, click there. So the idea of revolting against a oppressive government does not back up seceding because the guy you didn't want got elected to be president of the United States, which is what happened in the South.
He fucking murdered it. And then he turned it into a Soviet one. Though that's actually a bit of an insult to the Soviets, seeing as on at least one occasion they actually allowed states to secede without fucking murdering them. If we accord with Lincoln's interpretation...
In 1991, after there had already been a coup, they allowed it.
Union is voluntary and immutable once enjoined, then the New England secessionists refusing to send men in arms to fight during the War of 1812 would have qualified as sedition. Yet as we've already established, James Madison, president at the time, and I'd remind you, father of the Constitution, specifically refused his right to suspend habeas corpus without an act of Congress, and most importantly, did not raise the largest standing army ever seen in human history to that point, and proceed to murder 500,000 of his countrymen with it.
Again, no states in the North fired on a federal fort armed with soldiers in rebellion, and none of those states left the Union. You cannot compare the two.
And really, the reasons for secession are immaterial. South, East, West, or Northeast, all of them could have seceded, citing any reason whatsoever, from a steady train of abuses and usurpations.
That is totally his opinion. There's no basis in fact for him to say any of them could have seceded anytime they wanted to. It was totally okay, and everyone understood that. No, they didn't.
The inborn desire to erect a utopia for baby blue fucking Smurfs and still be in the constitutional right. As a great American president once said, quote, any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise it. Any portion of such people that can, may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit.
Jefferson.
As said on January 12th, 1848 by Jefferson. Oh shit, that was Abraham fucking Lincoln, wasn't it? Lest you believe that was a one-off, old Abe himself later appeared to reverse position on the subject of secession.
Wait a second now, because we have been pulling out quote after quote after quote from Lincoln to argue that what he said in 1832, well, we know that's who he really was. But wait, you just pulled a quote from the 1840s, and you're saying we should just completely discount that.
When he helped set up a Republican puppet state in the western half of Virginia in 1864 and incite them to what? Secede! Unfortunately for him, it was
not true at all. He didn't set it up. Those are the people who lived there, and what they were doing was not seceding from Virginia. They were saying, we don't support seceding from the Union. We choose to remain in the Union. Not the same thing.
Was also unconstitutional, as the federal government has no constitutional authority to simply make a seceding state. Governments are explicitly defined as being created by the people within said region. His own Attorney General, Edward Bates, said as much. In fact, much of the more vivid accounts of Abraham Lincoln's tyranny comes not from some imaginary Southern straw man shrieking lost cause slogans across the cotton fields, but from people in Abe's own administration. In fact, if one goes categorically through the Declaration of Independence to the so-called train of abuses Jefferson and the Funky Bunch claimed they'd suffered under English occupation, well, let's just say the slightest of patterns emerges. Point number 1, King George abolished their representation and installed English minders, effectively regional dictators, to oversee incompliant colonies. Sorta kinda like the martial law conquered southern territories labored under, or the outright military dictatorships that ruled over the southern United States for another, 12 titty fucking years after the Civil.
So now we're gonna argue that Reconstruction was unconstitutional and illegal. Literally the only thing that kept mass numbers of freed slaves from being just re-enslaved.
War. Point number 2. The King of England leaned on or removed judges until they complied with his political will. You know, like when Lincoln arrested a federal judge for criticizing his assumption of imaginary dictator powers while suspending habeas corpus. Point number 3. The King of England created new bureaucratic offices from whole cloth while sending, quote, swarms of officers to harass the people and eat their sustenance. Like, Abraham Lincoln's bureaucratic hydra that oversaw Southern affairs even long after his death. And as for swarms of soldiers, would you consider, say, a secret police that at one point was ordered to fire upon and murder hundreds of New York protesters during the draft riots to beat all?
It wasn't secret police. That was the military sent to put down a rebellion, a riot that was happening in one of the largest cities.
Swarm-like? What about General Benjamin Butler, who ordered that, quote, any Southern woman failing to show the proper respect to Union soldiers would be regarded as a prostitute and treated like one?
You could argue those women were guilty of assault, though. They were throwing stuff out of windows on Union soldiers, and that was what he was responding to. And this was during a military occupation where martial law was in force in New Orleans. And he was a Democrat, by the way, Benjamin Butler.
But I wonder what he meant by that. I mean, you could go point by point down the Declaration, keeping armies among the people. Well, if by keeping you mean arresting and fucking killing, then sure, rendering the military independent of the citizenry. Well, Lincoln sure as shit instituted the draft, didn't he? Soldiers quartering among us, cutting off all trade, imposing taxes without consent. Point by...
I had to stop because he's said it multiple times now in this video. He keeps talking about Lincoln instituting the draft, and the implication being that Lincoln just somehow unilaterally used dictatorial powers to start drafting Americans. That is not the case. The Enrollment Act was passed by Congress and signed by Lincoln, and it's something we have used multiple times since then, and that most major powers have used as well. The British used it, the French used it, the Germans have used it, the Soviets have used it. Every major country uses drafts in time of war now. That was not something that Lincoln did unilaterally without congressional approval.
Ass-pounding point. Every crime the founders ascribed to the English and King George, though more rightly credited to Parliament, who at that point were far from funkadelic, can just as readily, in some cases even more obviously, be ascribed to Abraham Lincoln.
And I should point out, too, while I'm thinking about the whole draft thing, the Confederacy, which he has been defending as having the right to do what they did, also had the draft. And there were multiple times when Jefferson Davis lamented the fact that he didn't have the same central authority to do things that Lincoln had.
Here's the kicker. Most of that train of abuses occurred before the fucking war. If the Civil War was treason, so the fuck was the American Revolution. Not because lost causers say so, because the goddamn Declaration does. Oh, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of said document, his grandson, Thomas Garland Jefferson, fought for the Confederacy and died at the Battle of Newmarket. Now,
he also had a grandson who died fighting for the Union at the Battle of Chickamauga. So, if you're going to argue one, let's point out the other ones too.
I assured all of you this wouldn't be a video about the Civil War. And look, I won't. But there are 2 chapters of such that simply must be discussed to truly comprehend the demoniac nature of the despot in question. Its incitement and its conclusion. As I said previously, the problem with alleging Lincoln's every act was justified on the basis that he was facing treason and civil war is that he didn't inherit a civil war, he inherited a secession crisis. Abraham Lincoln helped engineer a civil war. Whatever your feelings on the outbreak of the Civil War or its inciting event, the siege of Fort Sumter, allow me to reiterate, the South do not need to be the good guys for Lincoln to be bad. The South had seceded, and at least until that point had done so without firing a shot. The Union maintained military bases in the South in explicit defiance of this fact.
Wait a second. So, federal forts that were already owned by the Union, you're arguing to me that they were holding on to their property, United States property, in defiance of the South. Oh my gosh, boy, the mental gymnastics he is doing right now to try and prove that Lincoln was the bad guy here is just incredible.
Remind you all that we warred with England twice over this very same behavior. Lincoln nevertheless assured all that it was not an act of
No. When did the British government in 1812 own property that the United States fired on to start a war?
An aggression, and to underscore his point, he vacated several military bases throughout the South when pressed to do so. A Confederate Peace Commission were dispatched to secure a separate peace. Lincoln ignored them. French diplomat and poet Alexis de Tocqueville offered to independently arbitrate a peace between the parties. He was rebuffed by Lincoln for weeks upon weeks.
Because it was a peace that was predicated on the Confederacy being allowed to just leave and have its own country.
As tensions mount and the local populations complain of being ransacked by Union looters, Lincoln assures everyone in the media he intends to cede Fort Sumter to the South. And then he reinforces it with an armed military escort in tow
he sent troops to a fort. What a concept.
For some bizarre reason, have explicit orders not to fire, even if fired upon, almost as if he expects it. Just aggressive enough to provoke retaliation, but no.
He was sending a resupply mission to federal troops in a federal fort.
Not aggressive enough to appear the architect of the Civil War. See what's happening here? Because outside observers from Europe and elsewhere certainly did. Hell, even local papers, as the Providence Daily Post put it, quote, Mr. Lincoln told newspapers for 3 weeks that Sumter was to be abandoned. Now Mr. Lincoln has found a way to author a civil war without appearing its aggressor.
No one forced the South to fire those shots. Nobody forced them to do that. You could argue, hey, if the South didn't want to be aggressive, if the South wanted peace, they didn't have to fire on that fort.
Unquote. Lincoln wanted a war desperately. Not because your lost cause straw man says so. Not because I say so. But because after the first shots were fired, fucking Lincoln said so. In a letter to Union Naval Commander Gustavus Fox dated May 1st, 1861, just weeks after the Sumter bombardment, which resulted in 0 fatalities, might I add, Honest Abe would write, quote, you and I both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter, even if it should fail. And it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified by the results.
That does not argue what he thinks it argues at all.
Unquote. See, what I deliberately didn't mention earlier on is that Lincoln was warned not just by the South, but by his own generals that reprovisioning Fort Sumter would be an act of war. Lincoln not only did so, he sent along an armed battleship escort just so the South didn't misinterpret his provocative intention.
Again, show me any sovereign nation on earth that doesn't have a right to provision their own fort and their own soldiers. Who doesn't have the right to do that? And in what situation would it not be an act of aggression and war to fire on a resupply mission where a government is supplying a fort that already belongs to it?
After promising repeatedly he would not, including once mere hours before the event. Gustavus Fox himself would later recall that it seemed important to Lincoln to, quote, show the South as having fired upon bread.
Well, yeah, because Lincoln wasn't going to fire the first shot, and he was just letting them reveal how important this was to them, that they were willing to go to war to keep their country.
War of 1812 was waged because the T-Swill and fucking Redcoats wouldn't vacate their military bases in American territory. Why would Lincoln make and to reinforce a military base in southern...
That was not, by the way, the main cause of the war.
...territory with an armed naval escort when he'd vacated numerous southern bases already by that point be taken as anything other than a provocation.
And again, this was not a fort in Confederate territory. This was a fort that was owned by the Union, had been for decades, and now, just because these people had seceded, it doesn't suddenly make it belong to someone else.
Lincoln's own secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, admitted not only had Lincoln maneuvered the South into a situation where they would basically have to be the first to fire.
They didn't have a choice. He forced them to do it. They couldn't help themselves. Come on.
But that it was, quote, important that the rebellion be put in the wrong in the process, unquote. This, of course, contradicts Lincoln's own words before Congress later when he claimed he acted without guile.
I would love to see a scenario like this where I went and said, well, the guy walked past me with $100,000 in an envelope. I had to take it. I couldn't help myself. He knew that I would take it by walking past me with that money. What choice did I have? It's all his fault.
Reinforcing Fort Sumter. You couldn't have acted with more guile if you hurled a fucking sonic boom at the fort, you black-eyed bitch-made sociopath. But I'll not hear anyone called a sociopath.
Here's the thing. When you can't win an argument on the basis of facts and information, you resort to name-calling. That's just the reality.
Path. In William Tecumseh Sherman's company.
Oh, here we go.
A rare instance where even the statist circle jerk of mainstream historians inevitably fail to mollify Lincoln's murderous legacy. General Sherman's march to the sea is called an atrocity even by academia, but the truth is,
no, it's not.
An ongoing...
It is not called an atrocity by academia. I would say that most people recognize it as the beginning of what we know as total war.
Series of atrocities. And if the court historians of the cult of Abraham assert that the Civil War was waged to help blacks and end slavery, someone forgot to tell General Sherman, for his host burned, lynched, and raped at least as many blacks as whites, to the point that only recently liberated slaves in many southern towns turned on their Union liberators and engaged in open guerrilla fighting on the Confederacy's behalf.
Sherman was quoted once as saying that he believed...
Oh, here we go. Now we're going with the whole, all the black Confederates. Okay.
...that slavery was good for black people. So we know that he was no liberal.
Which will tend to happen given lovely episodes like having a noose slung around your neck until you tell Sherman where Confederate bases are located, or being held down and forced to watch as your wife and daughter are raped by the same Union soldiers that just turned your town into a parking lot. When a long line of liberated slaves began to follow on the heels of Sherman's army. Presuming they'd be born to freedom in the fucking North or some shit, he enslaved them a second time instead, enlisting them as unpaid servants for his fucking officers. Don't worry, though. Upon crossing a major river by boat, he made sure to keep his troop boats on the other side of the river, never sending them back across, and thus ensuring the liberated slaves were stranded without a roof, clothes, or fucking food.
But a large group of runaway slaves, perhaps more than 1,000, were following behind and slowing down the march. After crossing the creek, the soldiers pulled up the pontoon bridge, leaving the slaves stranded.
Sherman's army was marching through the countryside, living off the land. They'd cut themselves off from their base of supply, and they were out of communication, everything. This was just an act of military necessity. They couldn't have thousands of civilians slowing them down. They couldn't feed them. It would have actually been worse to allow them to follow. This is not an argument to make. And furthermore, Lincoln was not in communication with Sherman during all of this. He didn't know where Sherman was or what was going on. So if you're going to use all of this to pin this on Lincoln, Lincoln had no idea what was going on.
Stranded on the other side. With Confederate cavalry closing in, many of them jumped into the creek. It's estimated that hundreds of them, unable to swim, drowned.
At the risk of greatly softening the impact of this ghoul's military excursions, I'll only summarize the gory goddamn details. From the razing of Shenandoah to the burning of Columbia and Atlanta, simply saying these names and events out loud I find robs them of their true import. Many modern historians dismiss these events as mere angry northern troops losing discipline and looting, but the truth of the matter is that looting, pillage, arson, and rape were a well-ordered business.
Show me evidence that Sherman ordered any of it. And since this is a video about Lincoln as a dictator, show me evidence that Lincoln ordered Sherman to do it or permitted Sherman to order these kinds of things.
Under General Sherman, there were specialized squads who often immediately after Sherman assured the local population all property would be unmolested, would then arrive armed with crowbars, axes, and hammers with a full kit of arson paraphernalia in tow, and then proceed to level entire towns, stopping immediately and leaving in utterly orderly fashion once they'd concluded. These were not isolated incidents.
You're destroying their ability to make war and to support the war. This is total war. A few years later, this became the norm of what would happen in war.
Was Lincoln?
And again, tell me how any of this relates to Lincoln being a dictator.
Conception of warfare as enacted by General Sherman. Take a trip through the Deep South sometime. You'll periodically pass a stone marker here or there, often with an accompanying plaque describing a settlement that existed up until Sherman's march. The TV Western Hell on Wheels features a traumatized Southern protagonist who hails from Meridian, Mississippi, a city that ceased to exist after Sherman's march to the sea.
Now we're using fictional characters from TV shows to make our argument.
According to me, according to Sherman. Meridian, with its depots, storehouses, arsenal, hospitals, offices, hotels, and cantonments,
Wait, Sherman said this before the war. In 1854? I'm guessing he probably meant this to say February 1865.
Longer exists, he stated, as a city still smoldered behind him.
I was with General Sherman on his march south. What we did.
Really?
Evil.
This is your argument?
Unspeakable things.
A quote from a movie, a TV show?
Is to confess.
Fictional one?
God.
Well, I mean, the fictional character in Hell on Wheels said it, so it must be true, and it must be Lincoln's fault.
No. No, I can't, Father.
Tell me about Meridian.
How do you know about Meridian?
Man, it's a good thing that guy murdered that former Union soldier to prove his point.
The thousands dead, robbed, and raped might have been considered fortunate.
There were not thousands of people killed by Sherman's troops on the march to the sea. That is a ridiculous assertion with no basis in fact.
As the remaining citizens were ordered at gunpoint to vacate the city with winter rapidly approaching. There were injuries on both sides, and Southern looting happened more than once, but the Confederacy never boasted anything approaching this level of administration-endorsed...
Yeah, they did it too, but he did it way more.
Institutional genocide. Lest we mistake
genocide
intent, in a private letter to his wife,
genocide.
He would describe the purpose of his campaign as, quote, extermination, not of soldiers alone, that is the least of the trouble, but of the people, unquote. To which his wonderful...
Let's pull out the full quote, shall we, instead of just a little bit of what tries to make your point. Okay, so first of all, I should point out that this letter he wrote to his wife that this is quoted from was from 1862, not 1864. And so is her reply.
And that is the least of the trouble, but of the people.
But I couldn't find the whole letter anywhere.
Wonderful wife,
just a lot of
Eleanor
people quoting the letter to make the argument that he's making.
Ewing would express arousal at the prospect of the war being one of, quote, extermination, and that all Southerners should
also
be driven
62.
like swine into the sea. May we carry fire and sword into their states until not one habitation is left standing. What soaring prose! Long may she rot. And if Abraham Lincoln was celebrated for his unprecedented micromanagement of the Civil War, and indeed he is, then the cult of Lincoln's feeble attempts to allege that these were isolated incidents of which he was utterly oblivious and never once ordered approach the order of outright barking lunacy. In preparing for this presentation, I consumed a litany of sources, from favorable, fluffy accounts of Lincoln the Liberator.
And yet you constantly got dates wrong and facts wrong and simple arguments out of context.
To lost cause agitprop pronouncing him a demon made flesh. I'm here to tell you nothing I read about Lincoln or the Civil War turned my stomach like William Tecumseh Sherman's personal collected memoirs. Unless you still stubbornly cling to the facile ahistorical belief that Lincoln was unaware of and never once personally ordered or endorsed the war crimes of General Sherman, this despite the fact that he left Washington to personally meet with such no less than 11 times and often slept in the telegraph office in Washington to correspond more quickly with his general. It's the words of Sherman himself that will disabuse you of that delusion. In his memoirs, Sherman describes a gathering of Lincoln and his victorious generals convened in March of 1865, a mere month from the demoniac in question catching the most deserved bullet in history, wherein he describes Lincoln as requesting a deep...
So now we're advocating for murder being justified. Okay. This tells me all I need to know about the kind of person this is.
Detailed account of his march to the sea, and that Lincoln, quote, particularly enjoyed hearing stories of the activities of his, quote, bummers.
Again, how is that proof Lincoln ordered it? You can say Lincoln supported the idea after the fact. That is not evidence that Lincoln ordered Sherman to do those things, or that Sherman ordered the things that happened, or that any of it constitutes a war crime.
Bummers being the cutesy fucking name Sherman gave to his trained squads of arsonists, looters, and rapists, whose task it was to level entire southern cities to the ground. And far from doing it all to preserve the Union, as I believe I've already established, he quite clearly fucking destroyed it. Put it this way. If you're an American and someone asks what country you're in, what do you say? The United States. Singular. You don't say Louisiana, one of the United States. Prior to the Civil War, United States was plural. The proof that the...
Which is not the way to keep a country together. When you ask people from England, do you ask them, what country are you from? Do they say, oh, I'm from Norfolk? No.
Authoritarians won and the Civil War was actually about ending the right of secession is in every sentence you have ever uttered that involved the United States of America. And most motherfuckers never notice. That's why this video exists, because it isn't just about Lincoln. It's about the merits of self-determinism, one of the founding principles upon which we were formed, and the fact that we all but worship the man who participated in, if not engineered, an entire war just to end that right definitively, having spent his entire political career prior to that point explicitly saying he wished to do so. And yet a flock of fuckheads all around the world still insist he did it all for a principle he never held: the freedom of his fellow man. Something no U.S. president in history has done more to abrogate at once. I'd say it blows my mind, but no one's mind was more blown in the end than his. I'm Sic Semper Tyrannis Fist. God fucking speed.
All right, so he had about 5 minutes of valid arguments in that hour and 7-minute rant, which was full of using quotes to argue things that weren't being argued by those quotes, insults, advocating for murder while complaining about crimes being committed by other people, celebrating that murder multiple times, just wrong information at times with wrong dates and wrong things like that, claiming things that are true that aren't true, ascribing blame to people who weren't responsible for things. By and large, that was one of the worst factually baseless arguments I've ever seen. There was about 5 minutes worth of quality information and all of that. So I do not think I'll be reacting to any more of his stuff unless it's directly to refute this crap again in the future. So let me know what you thought. Use the comment section below. Tomorrow we'll be back with whatever our patrons and our members voted on as being our next reaction. Thanks for watching.